Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lobel. Getting it wrong still again. The growing acceptance of the China lab leak theory demonstrates the utter incompetence of the ruling elites. Will they ever be held to account? Also, the West often uses the issue of human rights as a political weapon. Now it's being used against the West. To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He's a historian, analyst, and author of the new book, Arise Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics. And in Budapest, we cross to George Samueli. He is a podcaster at The Gaggle, which can be found on YouTube, Rumble, and Locals. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. All right, let's go to George first in Budapest. Well, George, you and I have been watching very carefully the flipping of the narrative, as it were, here, where even a few weeks ago, even whispering online that there was a possible alternative explanation for the advent of the pandemic, you would have been, just a crazy a conspiracy nutcase and to be avoided and to be shunned and probably banned. Okay. Now we see the narrative changing. Now, no one on this program is going to make any definitive claims because we can't. We don't have the information. But there seems to be a trickle effect that, the narrative that was established by the ruling elites it's unraveling before our eyes. And will they be held account? Because weapons of mass destruction, nope, they got that one wrong. Okay, and then explaining why there was a financial crisis in 2008 and who benefited and who lost. Then we have this entire tumult during the Trump administration where anything he said was a lie. Okay, they have scrambled the public sphere so badly. They have put egg on their face, and there's no reason whatsoever to trust these people whatsoever. Everything they touch, they get wrong. George.
Well, you summarized it perfectly. We had the weapons of mass destruction claims, disastrous war. Not only did no one suffer any consequences, other than obviously the Iraqis and the dead and wounded American servicemen, but the people were elevated into prestigious positions on TV shows. They became pundits. They got nice, well-paying gigs at think tanks. They were celebrated. They got everything wrong. They were celebrated. And then, of course, there was the Russiagate. You had the 4 years of unremitting propaganda that the 2016 election was stolen by the Russians. Trump was working for Putin. The Russians were everywhere. Again, not one piece of evidence has ever come forward. And in fact, all of the evidence that has come forward has refuted these claims, yet no one has suffered any consequences. The only ones who have been suffered consequences were the people who were unfairly persecuted for supposedly working for Putin, such as Michael Flynn or Roger Stone. So what do we have here? We were told that we stupid rubes don't understand science. This is science. These are pandemics. These are global pandemics. Leave it to Bill Gates. Leave it to Tony Fauci. They understand these things. We don't know anything. Now suddenly it turns out that this virus was the product of scientists undertaking reckless research. It looks like this was research funded by US taxpayers, scientists who didn't bother to make sure that proper safety protocols were in place because these were very dangerous experiments. And worst of all, scientists who deliberately misled the public because they knew a great deal. Tony Fauci knew a great deal about this, and yet he misled the public. He went into one White House meeting after another and never so much as gave a hint about gain-of-function research going on in that Wuhan lab, and that the US government knew quite a lot about these gain-of-function research. Well, did Fauci pay any price? No, he's already signed a very nice book deal.
Particularly since Dr. Anthony Fauci's name is synonymous with gain of function. Okay, that is obviously been misrepresented to the public. Marcus, one of the things we've looked at. I started out with the Iraq War here. don't you find it really remarkable that this professional managerial class at different points in time and places, they're experts on weapons, they're experts on climate, they're experts on science, they're experts on Russia, okay? And this professional managerial class, they're so in tune with their own accreditation and their moral superiority over everyone else, is that, it ends up being just an accreditation class without any kind of substance, because that guy keeps saying everything they touch goes wrong. And with this pandemic, Russiagate was an illusion in people's minds. Lockdown is real. When you lost your job, you lost your family, you lost your health, you lost your future. That is real, and someone must be held accountable for it. And we know exactly who to look for.
Well, I'm not going to sit here and act as a defense counsel for the Chinese government, but I will approach the matter as a legitimate court of law would, the likes of which cannot be found at, for example, The Hague. So I expect, in fact, I demand credible, concrete evidence from those American politicians and journalists who are claiming that China is responsible for what is known as COVID-19. Not circumstantial evidence, not hearsay, concrete evidence which will clearly and emphatically indict the Chinese government. But unsurprisingly, no such evidence has been forthcoming from those American politicians. Like how the Americans, and of course the British, made claims in the past which were never substantiated. So, for instance, yes, there is the claim, and it was proved to be a lie, that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, but also the Americans and the British lied about the Serbs committing genocide in Kosovo and Metohija. They lied about Colonel Gaddafi preparing to commit genocide in Benghazi. So no evidence is ever actually put forward by these people. Yes, on the one hand, they are not experts when it comes to weapons of mass destruction. They're not experts when it comes to Russia. They're not experts when it comes to the former Yugoslavia. They're certainly not experts when it comes to medicine and science. But the real question is, why are they allowed to act as they do? Because they know, and when I say they, I'm referring to, in this instance, American politicians. They know that American mainstream media will not hold them to account. Why? Because American mainstream media is neither free nor independent. So that is why American politicians and also their equivalents in Britain are able to make such outlandish claims, such grand claims about any matter they choose to, because they know they will not be scrutinized. They know they will not have to corroborate their assertions with concrete evidence. So at the beginning, I said this matter should be approached as a court of law would approach it. And if you approach it as a proper court of law would, the case would be thrown out because there is no concrete evidence. The only evidence that American politicians and journalists are putting forward is merely circumstantial and hearsay, and that is not good enough.
George, the problem for the professional managerial class here is that at the end of the day, they don't have a problem blaming another country. We see this, it's Russia's fault, it's Iran's fault, North Korea's fault, the usual thing here. The problem is that there are so many high-level officials, Fauci and Fauci-like officials, that are just hip deep in all of this, and they don't know how to separate. See, that's why they never went down that path. Oh, because Trump's a racist and all. That is just a cover. It's nonsense, okay? On the face of it, it's just stupid nonsense, and they knew it. But if you look closely at an alternative theory, you're going to be looking at people not just in Beijing or Wuhan. You're going to be looking at a lot of people in Washington.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, I think there hasn't really been a major accusation against China. What happened in the United States was that what you call the professional managerial class seized on the virus as a way, finally, to get rid of Trump. I mean, Trump seemed to be coasting towards re-election. Suddenly, they saw this as an opportunity. They could blame him. It's all his fault for the virus. He didn't respond quickly enough, strongly enough. He's responsible for the economic downturn. He's responsible for the anti-Chinese feelings, the anti-Asian racism. He's responsible for that. He's a nativist. He's a xenophobe. There wasn't really a major attempt to attack China for it. I mean, it was when Nancy Pelosi said, it's the Trump virus. It's not the China virus, it's the Trump virus. So, and I would just slightly disagree here with Marcus. I mean, the cases that he cited, Iraq cooperated with the international weapons inspectors. I mean, he said, we're going to throw everything open. But that wasn't good enough for an American elite that was determined on war. Same thing happened in Yugoslavia. Remember, Milosevic threw open Kosovo to all of the inspectors. The OSCE sent in the inspectors. They withdrew the inspectors in order to facilitate the bombing. China has refused to cooperate with international inspectors. So when the World Health Organization put forward a plan to inspect the laboratory, China balked and refused to deal with anyone other than their man, which was Peter Daszak. So obviously the report that the WHO came up with was ludicrous. I mean, it was headed by someone who was an interested party. So I think that is a little bit different from the previous cases.
But what is the same here is that Marcus, there is no accountability. I mean, it's really quite remarkable in my mind is how all of these people fail upward. I mean, you can be absolutely wrong on just about everything in your career, but you just get to a better air-conditioned office outside of Washington, D.C. with a very nice income and given another mandate to screw up, and then you just keep moving forward. Nobody's ever held account for all of these catastrophes we've seen in this century alone. And it's because this is the professional managerial class protecting itself. It is a racket. Go ahead, last answer goes to you, Marcus.
Indeed, Peter, there is a common pattern, and we have seen this in the last 30 years, and specifically since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when America was very aware that it had no competition any longer on the international stage, when they knew there was no counterbalance to American global designs. And therefore, American politicians and American journalists felt emboldened to say whatever they wanted about any subject matter as they pleased to. And one of the things that all of this has in common is that the countries which are focused, which are targeted by American politicians or American mainstream journalists, just happen to be countries which pursue an independent foreign policy.
Okay, we're going to discuss this a little bit more in the next part of our program. I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. This is the home edition. To remind you, we're discussing some real issues. Okay, let's go back to Budapest. George, let's change gears here. All three of us have a long enough memory to remember when the whole issue of human rights was injected into foreign policy. We usually associate it with Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter's name is mentioned all the time these days, I would say for many wrong reasons, but in this case, it's true. Jimmy Carter very much highlighted it. And in principle, I have no problem with it. If it's weaponized, then I do have a problem with it. We saw in the Anchorage summit in the past few months when the U.S. Secretary of State was lectured by his Chinese counterpart. And much of what the Chinese delegate had to say could have been taken from the playbook of the Democratic Party, throwing it right back at him here. And other countries are doing this as well. I mean, if you can look at how can a country like the UK talk about human rights when Julian Assange is languishing in a prison? How can a country like the United States holding hundreds of people without bail for the crime of what? Loitering because of the January 6th riot here. I mean, it's very easy to weaponize this, and it's if one can do it, then everyone can do it. And I think that this is something that is a shock to the professional managerial classes, that only we are allowed to talk about values, not anyone else. Hypocrisy. Go ahead, George.
That's exactly right. I mean, remember during the Cold War, the West used to talk about human rights. We talk about political rights, and then the Soviet Union would talk, oh yeah, all right, well, we may not be great at political rights, but we've got economic and social rights that you don't have. So everyone has a job, everyone has a house, and so we care for the people. And of course, the West dismissed that argument because the West was more prosperous than the Soviet Union. So, hey, well, we do better at this than you do. But I mean, it became, West had a lot of fun with it in the days of the dissidents. So when you have Siyavsky and Daniel, and then you had, of course, Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov, and you could say, look, these people are being persecuted for what? For their political views. I mean, they've committed no crimes other than they were opposed to the government. And it was, the West just had a lot of fun with that. And the Soviet Union really didn't have a very good answer to that. That has changed because now Russia has a very good answer. I mean, for instance, we talked about this Roman Protasevich. Now, Roman Protasevich was involved in instigating violence in the aftermath of the election in Belarus. He was instigating it while he was in Poland. There's direct evidence that he was instigating it. He was in the Azov battalion. Whatever he was doing there, that is a violent organization. Now, you mentioned Julian Assange. No, there's no evidence at all that he was involved in any kind of violence. There's nothing at all violent. He, published information, and yet this is happening in the UK, the very same UK that lectures others about media freedom. And then, of course, you have the case of the Capitol riot, where hundreds of people have been arrested. They're charged. That some of them are in prison without bail. They're in solitary confinement for what? For loitering, for trespassing, and the prosecution just gets to postpone again and again for bringing the cases to trial. Why? Because they want to use it for political ends as they move into an election year. So here you are clearly persecuting people for their politics. There's no record of it, no evidence of any of these people committed any violence. Their real crime is they don't really accept the legitimacy of the Biden election victory. You can argue with that, you can disagree with it, but that's all. They hold the wrong views and they are being punished for it. So, yeah, the tables have indeed been reversed.
Yeah, but Marcus, what really makes this tragic is that we should think about human rights, okay? And that is a legitimate area of concern here. But if you politicize it, you cheapen it, because then you're just looking to score points. You don't care about the cause. You care about scoring a point against your opponent in the media. It's just more of a PR strategy than it is having genuine concern for some people's rights being violated. That's what I find that's really, really sad about it, is because in itself it's a good idea, but the way it's being practiced is an abomination, and people and the idea of human rights itself is just completely denigrated. Go ahead, Marcus.
What we have witnessed over the last 30 years, and especially the last 20 years, is the appropriation and distortion of words and concepts by neoliberals, such as democracy, equality, racism, progressiveness, diversity, and, of course, human rights. Now, the aforementioned words and concepts today in 2021, on account of how neoliberals, especially in America and in Britain, have appropriated and distorted the meanings of these for their own depraved agendas, means that these words and concepts have lost all meaning in the world today. So we see in America and also in Britain, neoliberal activists, for example, from the woke rabble, calling for racism to be countered by taking the knee in honor of a hardened criminal who burgled the apartment of a pregnant black woman and then threatened to kill the same woman by jabbing a gun to her stomach. That is absolutely repulsive, but it serves as another demonstration that racism and the words racism and equality have lost all meaning. And if we turn to the American and British governments when it comes to human rights, well, the Americans and the British have never truly been committed to the concept of human rights, both during the Cold War and after the Cold War. What I would argue the difference is that during the Cold War, the mask was more or less secure on the faces of the Americans and the British. But following the end of the Cold War, and in particular the dissolution of the USSR, both countries became complacent. They became even more arrogant. And that is when the mask dropped, because they felt, as I said moments ago, they could do as they please on the international stage because there was no counterbalance. So today, human rights is actually a weapon that can be used against the Americans and the British. The British, for instance, make no secret of their close strategic friendship and relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most abominable countries in the world. And the Americans are still holding prisoners in Guantanamo Bay who have not been charged with any offences. So the Americans and the British are, in my opinion, quite in a precarious situation today, the likes of which they were not in during the Cold War. So I believe their arrogance and their complacency has helped to limit and weaken their hold on the world.
But George, whenever you confront these people, they have one word for you. You're a racist. I mean, not in my lifetime. I mean, we've had times where, when calling someone a socialist or something like that was like, oh my goodness. I mean, we've gotten so far away from that now because they don't want to have a conversation. And then they end up using words like equity. Like, what the hell does that mean? Okay, you don't agree with it. If you don't even understand it, you're a racist. I mean, this is how banal debate has become. It's become as banal as saying that you stand for human rights, and it comes from those people. Okay, equity for all, but but if you don't believe in equity, then you're somehow a rube and retrograde. And then you can't have a conversation, because if you don't believe in equity, then you're not even worth talking to. I mean, this is destroying any kind of logical discourse. Go ahead, George.
Right, no, that's exactly right. And I think Marcus makes an excellent point about this fraud of Black Lives Matter and this mandatory taking of the knee, as if somehow by doing so you are opposing racism. No, you are actually celebrating an organization that is dedicated toward racism. Leave aside the fact that it's obviously a multi-million-dollar racket in which woke corporations shell out millions without even bothering to wonder, where is the money going? And in fact, even to
it goes into real estate,
Mark, to that money?
It goes into real estate, apparently.
Yeah, exactly. That's a lot of money. Can you imagine any organization in the world anywhere that disposes of tens of millions of dollars and no one asks, what are you actually spending this money on? So this is absolutely the case. But what is really happening is that you're getting the US, UK, France, and all the European, they talk still as if this is still 1975, and we can lecture the world on human rights as if we are exemplars of respecting human rights.
George, where were the human rights for the yellow vests?
Exactly. That's another thing. Exactly. And this was a point that President Putin made at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum that you attended. He said, yeah, look, there are people who had rubber bullets shot at them. They lost their eyes. Can you imagine if we did anything of the sort? How the world would respond? And of course, then, I mean, racism is one response. I say, oh, whataboutism, whataboutism. No, it's not whataboutism. It's actually clearly indicating that, here, actually, the performance of the Western countries is worse than that of Russia. Russia actually treats its prisoners more humanely now than the Western countries. I mean, the violence that is used against the people who protested against the lockdowns, the violence against the yellow vests, and now this brutal imprisonment of the people who were involved on January the 6th. Clearly, the West's record is, we don't even have to go into Saudi Arabia. The West's record is worse than Russia's.
The last 30 seconds go to you, Marcus. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's a very depressing state of affairs. And I think it's one that's not going to improve anytime soon unless the ordinary person in America and in Britain actually learns to say no. No to the woke rabble who will never enter into a conversation, into a discussion, because that risks losing an argument on the basis of merits. So they will just simply end any prospect of a discussion by accusing you of being racist or being Islamophobic or being homophobic. So unless people in America and Britain say enough is enough, we are going to take back our societies, then this cancer will just become worse and worse.
Just say this to them. I don't talk to lunatics. Okay? That's how I feel. I don't talk to lunatics. All right, gentlemen, that's all the time we have. I want to thank my guests in Budapest and in London. I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RTC. Next time, remember, cross talk.